Glass exploded across the pavement like a rain of tiny knives. Metal screamed, long and tearing, clawing at the concrete right in the loop, where people in Chicago hurried past one another as if nobody had time to witness a tragedy. A black sedan spun in the packed intersection, skidding sideways over the crosswalk lines, then jolted to a stop, smoke surging up from the hood. And Brielle Harp, 27 years old, her server's apron still clinging to the smell of cheap coffee, didn't have time to think. She ran. 3 seconds. Just 3 seconds for an accident to become a stage, for strangers to become a crowd, and for a crowd to become an audience. Phones lifted, screens flared bright, people filmed, people commented, people stood perfectly still, as if someone else would do their part for them. Heat slammed into Brielle's face when she reached the car door. The handle was scorching like red-hot metal, burning into her palm, but she yanked anyway. The door groaned, and gave a fraction at a time, smoke pouring into her throat until she choked, her eyes stinging hard. Inside, an elderly woman was folded over the steering wheel, silver hair in disarray, blood beating at her temple, both hands still clamped down as if letting go would mean everything was over. "Ma'am, look at me," Brielle said, her voice shaking, never realizing she was pulling someone powerful beyond imagining back from the edge. She reached in, groping for the seatbelt. The latch stuck. Once, twice, her heart hammered like it wanted to burst. Then finally, a sharp click. Brielle slid an arm beneath the woman's shoulder and pulled. The weight collapsed onto her, heavy as a whole lifetime that no longer fought back. Her apron caught on the jagged edge of the door and tore open. Her skin scraped raw and burned, but she didn't stop. 10 steps, 15, 20. She lowered the elderly woman onto the street and dropped to her knees, 2 fingers searching for a pulse at the neck. There. Faint, but there. Brielle pressed her palm to the woman's cheek, trying to keep her awake with short, urgent words, like she was hauling a single thread up from a deep abyss. And right then, a strange man slipped through the crowd, too calm, too fast, bending down as if to help. His hand flashed something small, sharp, cold. Brielle saw it. Without thinking, she angled her body as a shield, pulling the elderly woman tight against her chest. "Back off," she snapped, her voice sharp as broken glass. In that moment, she wasn't a poor girl afraid of getting thrown out of her rented room for being late on the rent. She was a living wall. A siren tore through the air. Brielle let out a breath, then went rigid. It wasn't an ambulance. 3 black SUVs flooded the intersection from multiple directions, sealing every exit like a trap slamming shut. Doors flew open in unison. Men in black suits stepped out with earpieces and blank eyes, moving with military precision. This wasn't rescue. This was extraction. A tall, lean man emerged from the center vehicle. His gaze swept the scene with the coldness of a scalpel. The sedan, the smoke, the crowd filming, the elderly woman on the ground, and then it stopped on Brielle. With a single look, Brielle knew she'd touched something she wasn't supposed to touch. The elderly woman's eyes fluttered open, dark eyes, sharp and frighteningly lucid despite the bleeding. She looked at Brielle as if memorizing every line of her face. Then her thin hand suddenly clamped around Brielle's wrist. "That girl," she rasped, weak but loud enough to make the men in black suits hesitate, "is family." The man, Cameron Vale, didn't blink, but his jaw tightened, as if he'd just heard a sentence being delivered and carried out at the same time. And Brielle still didn't understand that, from that second on, her old life was over. If you got pulled into this story, don't forget to hit like to support me. Share the video with your friends if you're into dramatic stories like this one too. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episode. The men in black suits surged in like a moving wall. Nobody shouted. Nobody needed to bark orders. Everything snapped into place on its own, held together by a discipline that felt cold as steel. 2 of them split the line of bystanders who were filming, using shoulders and forearms to press. Not rough, but firm and final, forcing the crowd back and carving out a crescent of empty space around Brielle and Margot. Another man set a hand on Brielle's shoulder, not violent, but steady enough to make her understand she didn't get to choose where she stood anymore. Brielle jerked away on instinct, clutching the old woman tighter, her eyes darting fast as she searched for the man whose hand had flashed that sharp, cold object a moment ago. But among hundreds of bright phone screens, among faces that were curious and afraid, he was gone as if he'd never existed at all, leaving behind the sickening sense that some people could come and go inside a crowd like this and no one would even notice. She opened her mouth to scream, to point, to force someone to see what she'd seen. But her voice was swallowed by car horns, by the hush of murmurs, and by the sedan's engine still ticking underneath it all like a countdown clock. The man who stepped out of the center SUV didn't hurry. He didn't move with the same restless urgency as the others. Still, his arrival changed the very breathing of the intersection. Cameron Vale looked over the crowd once, his gaze not pausing on the phones, not pausing on the smoking car, pausing only on the elderly woman in Brielle's arms, and then on Brielle. That look wasn't gratitude. It wasn't fear from a son who'd nearly lost his mother. It was the look of a surgeon deciding where to cut, where to stitch, where to remove what had to be removed. He signaled with a movement so small it was almost nothing, and 2 guards immediately bent down to lift Margot onto a stretcher. Brielle reacted on instinct, blocking them, her palm pressed to the old woman's chest as if the second she moved her hand, someone would steal her away. "Don't touch her. Call 911, she said, her voice shaking but hard, her eyes red from smoke and from fear. Cameron didn't answer right away. He lowered himself to her level, not to soften his tone, but to see more, he said. When his eyes caught the long cut on Brielle's forearm, he took her wrist with 2 fingers, gentle, and turned it slightly, inspecting it the way someone reads a field report. The motion was fast, clean, precise. So precise, it made Brielle shiver, because there wasn't a single second of ordinary hesitation in him. "You're injured," he said, and in Brielle's head the chaotic noise around her collapsed into clipped, sharp English, cold and straight. "I'm fine," Brielle answered, trying to pull her hand back. "She's the one who needs a hospital." Cameron let go, but he didn't look away. He flicked a glance at a guard, and the man immediately produced a clean cloth and pressed it into Brielle's hand, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. Brielle froze, because everything was happening too smoothly, too planned, as if they'd known there would be blood. She looked back at Margot and saw the old woman's eyelids tremble, her breathing still weak but steadier now. And then she heard someone behind her shout something out loud, the way people narrate a scene they've just recorded. And in that instant, Brielle realized the worst thing wasn't the smoking car or the strangers in black suits. It was the hundreds of lenses capturing her face from every angle. She stood, lifting her hand as if she could block the cameras, but it was useless. "Turn your phones off," she yelled at the crowd, and all she got back were irritated looks, as if she were ruining a show. Cameron watched that reaction, his jaw tightening. He straightened up, reached back without looking, and a guard placed a phone into his hand. Cameron tapped a few times. On the screen, a video was already spreading. A sensational headline, the glass exploding, Brielle charging into the heat, Brielle holding Margot. Her face was so clear Brielle felt her throat go dry and raw. "This is downtown Chicago," Cameron said, his voice low, like he was carving each word into the air. "Everything hits the internet before an ambulance gets here." Brielle forced herself to swallow, forced herself to cling to something simple and logical so she wouldn't panic. "Then you need to call 911. Then you need to get her to a hospital," she said, like she was arguing with a wall. Cameron tilted his head. His eyes went darker, no longer just cold, but dangerous. "No," he said. "The clip is up. They'll find you before the ambulance gets here." Brielle went still, her heart squeezing tight in her chest. "Who are they?" she asked. And the second the question left her mouth, she knew she'd stepped into a game whose rules she didn't know. Cameron looked down at Margot, then back at Brielle, as if weighing a new risk that had just appeared on the board. "You just pulled my mother out of a trap," he said, and his calm was steady enough to make Brielle's spine turn to ice. "Now they know your face, and you're not an outsider anymore." The SUV slipped out of the loop like a knife sliding beneath skin, leaving behind the blare of horns, the buzz of voices, and the phone lights still flickering like fireflies. Brielle sat rigid in the back seat, a bodyguard facing her, his eyes never leaving her as if one wrong movement could trigger an incident. Margot lay strapped to a fixed stretcher, held down by belts, her face turned slightly to the side, her skin pale, yet her eyes still cracked open now and then, strangely sharp, as if she were memorizing everything around her. Cameron sat up front, back straight, never turning around, but Brielle felt him like a weight of pressure pressing down on the cabin, making even the air afraid to breathe too loud. She looked down at the temporary bandage on her forearm. Blood had soaked through into a dark red smear, and in her mind the words "they'll find you" kept echoing like a curse. When the vehicle turned into an entrance with no sign, a wrought iron gate opened so fast Brielle felt as if it had recognized the SUV in advance, and only then did she understand what it meant to be somewhere outside any public system. There were no hospital signs, no chaotic emergency bay, no loudspeaker calling names, only a building of glass and stone, polished and bright, so clean it made you feel dirty just for breathing. Inside, the corridors shone like ice. The air carried a faint scent of antiseptic. White lights spread evenly overhead. The silence felt like a church, yet every corner held a small camera. Every door had an electronic lock, and the people in white coats moved at a measured pace, not fast, not slow, as if they were performing a role they'd rehearsed until it was muscle memory. Brielle was guided behind Margot's stretcher, her hand still reaching after it by some foolish habit, needing to be sure the old woman was still there. A middle-aged woman in a lab coat stepped forward, hair twisted into a neat bun, an ID badge hanging at her chest, though Brielle couldn't read it in time. The woman bent to take a quick look at Margot's face, then lifted her head and spoke to the nurse beside her in a professional tone. Prep the recovery room, follow Mrs. Vale's protocol, and pull her medication chart, especially the clo. She stopped short, as if she'd just realized a small error had slipped out of her mouth. Margot was still half conscious, but Cameron halted at once and turned, looking straight at that woman. He didn't need to raise his voice. His gaze alone cooled the hallway. The woman swallowed hard, blinking fast, and corrected herself. "I'm sorry, I mean the cov." This time she said it right, too right, as if she were reading from a sheet of paper, and then she lowered herself toward the stretcher, as if she could hide from Cameron's eyes by focusing on work. Brielle didn't know what the medication was, but she understood that the stumble and the correction weren't the kind of slip a tired person makes. It sounded like someone who had just said something she wasn't supposed to know. Cameron didn't say anything. He only lifted his phone to his ear and walked after the stretcher at an unhurried pace, but his voice was low and clear enough that Brielle caught a few broken pieces, like shards of glass still caught in her hair. "Recheck the staffing list for this shift. Anyone who said the wrong name for the medication. I want to know where she got that information." He paused, listening to the voice on the other end, his jaw tightening. "The intersection, camera data, not just civilians' video. I want to know who bought access." Another pause, his voice turning colder. "They bought it. Exactly what I thought." Brielle felt her heart drop, because in her mind she saw her own phone lying somewhere, and strangers zooming in on her face on their screens, circling it like a target. When they reached the waiting area, a guard extended his hand in front of her. "Phone," he said, not asking. Brielle stepped back on instinct, her hand touching her pocket, her fingers trembling. "I need to call my little brother," she said, her voice cracking from the effort of staying calm. The guard didn't change his expression. He only looked at Cameron for instruction. Cameron turned, his gaze resting on Brielle for a single second, part calculation, part warning. "You'll be able to call," he said, "but not with that." He gave a small signal, and the guard took Brielle's phone from her hand neatly, the way you take something dangerous away from someone who doesn't know how to handle it. Brielle opened her mouth to protest, but she saw, at the far end of the corridor, another man leaning against the wall, hands in his pockets, watching them directly, then turning away as if he'd only been confirming something. Brielle didn't know if he was a doctor or security, or a shadow following them, and that uncertainty twisted her stomach into a knot. "This is kidnapping," she blurted, not entirely as an accusation, but as a way to grab onto a familiar definition for her fear. Cameron didn't get angry, and that was worse. He only said, his tone even, "This is protection. You can't see the difference, because you don't yet know what they'll do the moment they get the chance." Brielle looked through the glass at the recovery room where Margot was being wheeled inside. The door closed so quietly it felt inhuman. And suddenly Brielle understood she was in a place where silence didn't mean peace. It meant an order bought with money and blood. And inside that order, her phone wasn't personal property anymore. It was a breach. She sat down in the stark white waiting room, her bandaged hand clenching until it hurt, watching the ceiling lights reflect on the floor polished like a mirror. And she wondered, if even a medical staff member could say the wrong thing, something only family was supposed to know, then how many people in here were truly on their side? And how many were standing with whoever wanted Margot dead? And she, a poor server whose face had just been exposed, was sitting right between the two, without a phone to call for help. Brielle sat in the blinding white waiting room like she'd been trapped inside a photograph, scrubbed clean of color, leaving only cold light and the distant echo of footsteps, ticking at her nerves like the hand of a clock. She didn't know how long it had been. She only knew that every time an automatic door slid open and then sealed shut again, her heart jumped as if she were waiting to hear a sentence handed down. Cameron stood at the far end of the corridor, speaking to someone on the phone, his voice low and even, and every phrase he delivered felt like a chess piece being set on a board. Brielle, meanwhile, had only one thing in her head. Noah, Noah, Noah. A prayer repeated until it turned hoarse inside her. She sprang to her feet when a guard brought her a different phone, a black device with no flashy case and none of her familiar scratches, and placed it in her hand the way someone hands over a loaded gun. 3 minutes, the guard said, not meeting her eyes. Brielle turned to Cameron, her gaze hooking into him like a claw. "I need to talk to my brother right now," she said, fighting to keep her voice from breaking. Cameron looked at her for a second, then gave a small nod. The kind of nod that wasn't agreement so much as confirmation of something inevitable. "Keep it short," he said. "And don't say where you are." Brielle swallowed hard and dialed a number she knew so well she didn't have to look at the keypad. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, and then Noah answered. Her brother's face appeared on the screen, young but hollowed out by lack of sleep, his eyes flicking constantly as if he kept looking over his shoulder. "Bree," Noah said, trying to smile, but the corner of his mouth trembled. "Where are you? You've been gone all day. I couldn't reach you." Brielle wanted to say sorry out of habit. She wanted to say she was fine, she was just busy, but she bit down and forced the apology back where it couldn't escape. "Noah, listen to me," she said, quick and tight. "You're at the boarding house, right?" Noah shook his head. The camera trembled slightly, like he was walking or standing somewhere he didn't dare stay still. "I just got back near it," Noah said, lowering his voice. "There's a strange car parked at the mouth of the alley since this afternoon. Black, tinted windows. Not a neighbor's car. I've seen it since you were still at work." Brielle felt the blood in her body turn cold. "Have you gone inside yet?" she asked, and for the first time she heard herself speak like someone giving orders, not someone begging. "No," Noah said fast. "I'm standing in the grocery store across the street, pretending to shop. I can see the plate. I'm trying to remember. I think it's—" Noah angled the phone toward the glass to pan to the alley, and Brielle saw the corner of the vehicle. Exactly as he'd said. Black and still, like an animal lying in wait. "Don't stare," Brielle said, her heart pounding hard enough to hurt. "Don't go outside. Listen to me. Go deeper into the store. Stand where there are people." Noah nodded, his eyes still locked on the car. "The plate is—" Noah started to read it, and in that exact moment the screen jerked violently, Noah's image breaking into smeared blocks as if it were being crushed, and then the sound cut dead. Brielle stared at the blankness, as if staring long enough could make Noah reappear. "Noah," she called, her voice climbing. "Noah, hear me." Nothing answered. Only the long, cold tone of a disconnected line. She called back immediately. Once, twice, 3 times, but the call wouldn't connect. Brielle lifted her head toward the guard, then toward Cameron, and she saw that Cameron had already stepped close, his expression not surprised at all, as if he'd expected this. "The signal was jammed," Brielle said, not as a question, but as a realization that tightened around her throat. Cameron didn't answer her directly. He only lifted a hand and signaled the guards. One of them moved out at once, so fast it looked like his feet barely touched the floor. "They didn't want your brother reading the plate," Cameron said, his voice low, and Brielle felt anger flare in her stomach, hotter than fear. "Who are they?" she asked again, and this time her question didn't shake. Cameron looked at her as if measuring her strength, as if deciding whether she would break or stand. "People who want my mother dead," he said, "and people who want to erase anyone who saw." Brielle clenched the unfamiliar phone in her hand, as if she could crush it and squeeze Noah back into existence. She called again, and this time it rang, and Noah answered right away, breathing hard, his face white as paper. "Bree," Noah said. "I just saw someone get out of the car, wearing a cap, looking straight at the store like he's searching for somebody. I don't know if they saw me." Brielle wanted to scream. She wanted to run through every glass wall in this place and pull her brother away with her own hands, but something invisible held her in place, And that thing was the truth that she didn't have the power. "Noah, listen to me," she said, forcing her voice into a tight line. "Don't go back home. Go out the back door of the store and cross to the cafe on the corner, the one with cameras and lots of people. Sit down. Call me when you're safe. Do you understand?" Noah nodded hard, eyes reddening. "Where are you?" Noah asked, and Brielle swallowed against the hardness in her throat. "I'm okay," she said, and the words nearly killed her because they were only half true. "I'll call you back." The moment she ended the call, the phone buzzed once, and a message appeared from an unknown number. No name, no profile photo, just a short line, cold as a blade laid against the back of her neck. "You've seen too much." Brielle read it again and again, the blood in her veins thickening into ice. Then a second line appeared, as if the sender were smiling. "You think saving someone in the loop means you go back to your diner. You still have to feed your little brother, don't you?" A rushing sound filled Brielle's ears. They knew where she worked. They knew who Noah was. They knew things she hadn't said to anyone inside this white building. She looked up, staring at the spotless corridor, at the glass doors reflecting her pale face back at her, and for the first time she understood what it felt like to be hunted, not hunted out on the street, but hunted inside the very places people are taught to believe are safest. Cameron saw the shift on her face without needing to ask. His eyes stopped on the phone screen, then lifted to her. "Let me see," he said. Brielle held the device out, her hand shaking but not releasing it. Cameron read the messages, his jaw tightening, and in that moment the cold in him stopped being detachment. It became the cold of a man who had just confirmed that a war had begun, and the target wasn't only his mother. It was the girl standing in front of him, and her brother, and everything she had ever called her life. Cameron handed the phone back to the guard the way you pass off evidence after it's been sealed, then turned away and spoke a few short phrases into his earpiece, words that sounded more like orders than conversation. Brielle stood there with sweat slicking her palm, her mind spinning from the message she'd just read, from the image of Noah by the grocery store window, from the sick feeling that every white wall around her had ears. She wanted to keep asking. She wanted to scream that she didn't belong in this world, that she was only a server trying to pay her rent on time, but her throat tightened around something older than fear, the habit of reminding herself not to bother anyone, not to cause trouble, not to exist too loudly. She was about to say she was sorry, out of reflex, when the recovery room door opened as softly as air. A nurse stepped out, dipped her head toward Cameron, and said, "Mrs." Vale was awake and wanted to see the girl. Not the rescuer, not the waitress, but the girl. As if Margot had decided Brielle was a proper noun from the moment she'd been lying on the street. Brielle followed them down the long corridor, past sealed doors and white lights that made everyone look paler. And the farther they went, the more she felt like she was being led into a place without an exit. In the recovery room, Margot sat half-propped on pillows, an IV line draped across her wrist like forced jewelry, but her back was straight, her eyes bright, her gaze untouched by pain or medication. She looked at Cameron once, then stared directly at Brielle, as if there were only two women in that room, one who had just pulled her out of fire and one who had just decided the other woman's fate. "Come here," Margot said, her voice rough but clear, her English precise as a thin blade, leaving no space for refusal. Brielle stepped closer, her legs a little weak, one hand clamped around her bandage like she needed something solid to hold. Margot reached out, steady, and took Brielle's wrist, turning it slightly to examine the cut that had been wrapped neatly. "You got hurt because of me," she said, not as an apology, but as the acknowledgement of a fact. Brielle opened her mouth, instinctively reaching for its fine, reaching to soften the moment, but Margot lifted a hand and stopped her the way you stop a hollow phrase. "I didn't ask if you're fine," Margot said. "I asked your name." Brielle blinked. "Brielle Hart," she answered, and she heard how clear and final her own voice sounded, as if that name was the only thing she still owned in a room full of power. Margot repeated it slowly, as if carving it into memory. "Brielle Hart." Then she tilted her head, her gaze going deeper than skin. "Your parents." Brielle went rigid. She hated that question, because it always led to emptiness, to paperwork, to temporary rooms, to the feeling of being placed in a bin for lost property. I don't have them," she said, her voice shrinking even as she tried to hold it steady. Margot didn't look pitying, and that spared Brielle a deeper kind of shame. She only gave a small nod, like someone who had just understood why a young woman would run into heat without waiting for anybody else. "You have a little brother," Margot said next, and Brielle flinched because it wasn't a question. "Noah." Brielle swallowed hard and glanced at Cameron like a plea. But Cameron stood motionless, his eyes dark, as if he, too, had just realized his mother was walking straight into Brielle's weak point. "You knew," Brielle whispered, fear and anger braided together in the words. Margot held her gaze. "I know because this world knows. The message you received. Yes." Brielle felt blood rush into her ears. The sensation of being stripped bare made her want to step back, but Margot's hand still held her wrist, warm and firm, a strange kind of anchor. "Then why did you call me family?" Brielle asked, her voice shaking because she no longer understood anything. "Because you didn't move like an opportunist," Margot answered at once, without hesitation. At that intersection, someone bent down. I heard his voice. I smelled cold metal. I knew he wasn't there to help. "You saw it, and you covered me with your body." She stressed each word like stamping a document with truth. "That is not what someone does for money. That is what someone does to protect." Brielle wanted to say she only did what was right, but she remembered the crowd that hadn't, remembered the phones, remembered that right was sometimes rare. Margot released Brielle's wrist and reached toward the bedside cabinet. A small box sat there as if it had been waiting. She opened it and took out a thin pendant, old silver metal, with a small dark stone, not glittering like fashionable jewelry, but quiet, heavy, like a vow. "This," Margot said, "has been carried by Vale women for 3 generations. It is a sign. It tells everyone that the person wearing it belongs." Brielle stepped back half a pace on instinct. "No," she breathed. "I can't take that." Margot didn't argue. She simply lifted the chain, and while Brielle still hesitated, she fastened it around Brielle's neck with her own hands, slow but decisive, like a rite that could not be undone. Cold metal touched Brielle's skin, and she felt as if an invisible chain had just locked into place. "Mother," Cameron said, finally breaking the silence. One word only, but tight as a drawn wire. "No." Margot turned to her son, her expression unchanged. "What were you going to do?" she asked, her tone calm in a way that was almost cruel. "Send the girl outside to die, because you've put her in their sights." Cameron's jaw clenched. Anger and helplessness flashed in his eyes, the look of a man used to controlling everything who had just met the one thing he couldn't control, his mother. Brielle looked between them, one side power born from blood, the other power forged from cold, and she stood between them like a thin scrap of paper. Margot turned back to Brielle and placed her hand over Brielle's chest, exactly where the pendant rested, as if placing a period at the end of a sentence. "They've seen your face," she said, each word dropping with weight. "So I won't thank you with flowers or money. I'll thank you with the only thing that can keep you alive in this world." She held Brielle's eyes. "I choose you to live." After Margot slipped into drugged sleep with a calm that was almost frightening, Cameron pulled Brielle out of the recovery room with a brief, precise motion, like cutting a thread before it could wrap any tighter. The white corridor was still quiet, but now, to Brielle, that quiet felt like foam on the surface of deep water, hiding something that was moving underneath. She touched the pendant at her throat on instinct. The cold metal had warmed slowly against her skin, and the feeling of being marked made her want to rip it off and, at the same time, fear that if she did, the little protection she had would vanish with it. "I don't want to stay here," Brielle said as they passed the waiting area, her voice low but urgent. "I need to go. I need Noah." Cameron didn't look at her right away. He walked to a glass wall and looked down toward the parking area where the black vehicles still waited like obedient beasts. "No," he said, one word, straight and cold. Anger flared up in Brielle. "You don't have the right," Cameron turned, and his eyes cut through her sentence like a knife. "You think I'm keeping you because I enjoy it?" he asked, his voice still low. But there was a hint of exhaustion in it that made Brielle falter. "The public line isn't safe." Brielle frowned. "What do you mean, the public line?" she asked, because in her mind a hospital was a hospital. The police were the police. And if that world couldn't be trusted either, then who was left to trust? Cameron put a hand to his earpiece and spoke a few short phrases to his people, then looked back at Brielle as if deciding to give her a piece of truth, just enough for understanding, not enough to send her over the edge. "There are people in EMS," he said. "There are people in the police. If I take you to a public hospital, or let you call them yourself, you'll disappear during a transfer, or your file will be edited, or your call will be unrecorded. He used the word disappear the way someone talks about an ordinary procedure, and it made Brielle shiver. "You're talking like that's happened before," she said. And this time it wasn't anger. It was fear. Cameron went silent for a beat that was too long, then said, "It happens every time we get careless." Brielle swallowed hard and looked around at the men in black suits spaced along the corridor, each one a statue with ears. "Then what am I supposed to do?" she asked, her voice shrinking, almost helpless. Cameron held a hand out. "Come," he said. "We're leaving." Brielle looked back toward the recovery room, as if she needed to be sure Margot was still there. But Cameron had already turned away, and she understood that in this world she had only two choices: follow or be left behind. When they stepped outside, the afternoon cold hit Brielle's face and pulled her out of antiseptic air, dropping her back into the simple reality that Chicago was still moving, still loud, still indifferent, and somewhere Noah was standing in a store trying to pretend he was normal. They guided her into a different SUV, tinted windows, a cabin that smelled like new leather and metal. Cameron sat across from her this time, not in the front seat. That small change tightened Brielle's body, as if he wanted to watch her reaction. She pressed close to the door, clutching her bag of bandages, eyes fixed on the street sliding past, trying to guess where they were headed. But the dark glass turned everything into a silent film. "My estate," Cameron said, as if he'd read her mind. "The only safe place." "Your house," Brielle repeated, a trace of bitterness in her voice because she didn't know what else to do to keep herself awake. "I'm a stranger." Cameron didn't argue. "Yes," he said, "and that's why you're dangerous." The sentence caught in Brielle's throat, because she couldn't tell whether he meant she was dangerous to him, or dangerous to his enemies, or dangerous simply because she existed inside the wrong story now. The SUV rolled onto a stretch of highway, the tires humming in a steady rhythm like a heart trying to stay calm. Cameron glanced down at his phone. The screen lit up with an incoming call. No saved name, only a string of numbers. He stared at it for a second, longer than necessary, then answered. Brielle couldn't hear the other voice, only Cameron's clipped reply. "Yeah." A silence. Then Cameron spoke again, colder. "Not your business." The caller said something else, and this time Cameron didn't cut him off right away. He looked straight at Brielle while the other man spoke, as if he wanted her to understand that a shadow stood behind the story she'd fallen into. Then Cameron said, slowly, each word driven in like a nail, "I didn't bring anyone home. I brought evidence home." A beat, a low laugh, old and dry, crackled from the phone speaker, and Brielle caught one single line. A male voice, older, powerful, mocking like a dull blade scraping bone. "You brought another stranger home." Brielle's spine went cold. Cameron didn't answer that. He ended the call immediately, the motion sharp as cutting a cord that was tightening around a throat. But after the screen went dark, his face went dark with it, no longer just cold, but hard and edged, like a man who had just confirmed the enemy wasn't far away at all. Brielle looked at him, then at the phone, then back at the tinted window where the city slid by as a blur. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice small, because part of her didn't want to know, because knowing almost always meant pain. Cameron didn't answer, and in that silence, Brielle understood a truth more frightening than any name. Whoever it was, he was close enough to call straight into their vehicle, powerful enough to throw a mocking sentence that Cameron had to hear, and confident enough to remind them that a poor server who had just been marked was not Cameron's private secret. As the SUV left the highway and moved into quieter roads, thicker trees, fewer streetlights, Brielle touched the pendant again, and this time she didn't feel only the cold. She felt it like a tether tying her to a world she'd just stepped into, and in that world, the shadow that had laughed through the phone was somewhere very near, waiting for her first mistake. The iron gate of the estate appeared after a long bend in the road. No nameplate, no decorative lights, only towering black metal and two stone pillars thick as fortress walls, and in front of them, a glass guard booth where a man in a suit stood upright like a soldier, one hand resting near his belt, by the habit of someone who carried a weapon. The SUV slowed. A camera mounted on the stone pillar turned slightly to follow the vehicle. A small red light blinked on, then a quiet click sounded, and the gate opened like the jaw of a beast, willing to release its prey because it recognized the right scent. Through the tinted glass, Brielle saw the driveway stretching inward, trees on both sides trimmed with care, yet dense enough to hide everything beyond them, a green corridor leading into the belly of a place that did not want to be seen. She had waited tables in wealthy neighborhoods. She had seen big houses, wide lawns, expensive cars. But this was different. This wasn't display. This was defense. The small cameras fixed to tree trunks and corner walls, the sensor lights sunk into the ground, the reflective panes that hid the interior. Everything said the same thing. This place wasn't built to look beautiful. It was built to survive. The SUV passed the first security ring, then the second, and at every checkpoint, Brielle felt eyes tracking her. Not curious eyes, but inspecting eyes, as if she were an unfamiliar item being logged into an armory. When the vehicle stopped in front of the main house, the first thing Brielle noticed was the silence, the kind of silence where every sound had been controlled. No children, no neighbors, no barking dogs, only gravel crunching under tires and the car doors opening in unison like a ritual. She stepped out, and the cold immediately bit into her skin, and the pendant at her throat felt a little heavier, as if reminding her she wasn't a guest. She was a mark. Cameron got out at the same time, his gaze sweeping the grounds quickly, not to admire, but to check for anything wrong in this picture of security. A man approached from the front steps, medium tall, broad-shouldered, dark hair neatly combed back, eyes sharp but calm, the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. He stopped in front of Cameron, dipped his head just slightly, then turned to Brielle and studied her, as if weighing something that wasn't on paper. "I'm Miles Kersey," he said, his tone neither friendly nor hostile. "I'm in charge of security and operations here." Brielle almost nodded, almost said thank you. The reflex her serving job had trained into her. But she stopped the words before they could leave her mouth, because she understood that in a place like this, gratitude could be mistaken for debt. Miles didn't rush her. He only tilted his head a fraction, as if setting down a question that sounded like small talk, but carried a blade underneath. "What do you want most right now?" Miles asked, unblinking. Brielle heard faint murmurs behind her. The guards lined up with earpieces catching the light under their hair, some looking at her with irritation, some with a cold curiosity, as if placing bets on what she would say. She knew this was a test, not the kind you took in school, but the kind meant to measure what sort of person you were. Greedy, frightened, or smart enough to stay quiet. If she said money, they would laugh. If she said her own safety, they would call her selfish. If she said something poetic, they would mark it as fake. Brielle looked Miles straight in the eye, and this time she didn't lower her head. "Noah safe," she said. "No detours, not a single apology, no pleas, no begging. Just a sentence that came out like an order from the heart." In that moment the murmurs stopped, then rose again, softer, like wind sliding along a fence. "A burden," someone murmured so quietly it was meant to vanish. But Brielle heard it, because she had heard that word her whole life, heard it in temporary houses, in the things adults said behind her back, in the landlord's eyes when she was late on rent. Her fingers clenched, her nails biting into her palm, but she didn't turn to find the speaker, because she knew if she turned, she would show them the wound. Miles held her gaze for a beat longer, then something in his eyes shifted, as if an answer that honest made her harder to file away. "Not your own safety," Miles said, half question, half confirmation. Brielle didn't flinch. "I want to live too," she said. "But if I have to choose, my brother first." Miles gave a small nod. No praise, no judgment. But that nod felt like a narrow door opening. Cameron stood beside them, silent. But Brielle could feel his attention resting on her. Not the controlling stare from the intersection, but something else, an appraisal of a quality that didn't belong in any report. He watched the way she stood straight under cold eyes. He watched the way she didn't apologize for having a need. He watched the way she put her brother ahead of herself, and in his gaze there was something quick and thin, like a hairline crack in ice. And then he turned away and gave Miles a short, clipped order that Brielle would stay here, that no one was to approach her without permission, and that the security perimeter around her area was to be doubled. As if the moment she answered the test, Brielle stopped being only a stranger who had walked in. She became an official target inside this compound, and also a part of it, whether she was ready to admit that or not. Brielle was led up to the second floor by way of a wide staircase covered in dark carpet that made no sound, the kind of carpet meant for houses that don't want anyone to hear anyone moving. The hallway was long. The doors were closed. Each door had a small camera, a black, unblinking eye. A guard opened a room at the very end without explanation, only saying this was her room. then stepping aside as if the assignment was finished. Brielle walked in and stopped short, because the room was too beautiful for her life. Beautiful in a cold way, spotless, without the smell of people. The bed was made with white sheets, pulled flat like a blank page. The dark wooden desk held not a single scratch. A large window looked out over a garden that lay dark and silent, and on the armchair by the window, a simple set of clothes had been laid out, as if someone had prepared for her in advance, as if her arrival had been part of someone's plan. She pressed a hand to her chest and touched the pendant, trying to tell herself this was only a temporary room, only shelter. But a small voice inside her kept insisting that once you are brought in, you are rarely allowed to walk out on your own. Brielle shut the door, leaned against it for a second to breathe, then moved farther in, her eyes sweeping the space with the instinct of someone who had lived in unsafe places, looking for an exit, looking for a blind corner, looking for anything she could use as a weapon if she had to. And then she saw it, a cream-colored envelope placed neatly on the bedside table, centered like a gift, not sealed shut. No name written on it, only a red pen mark on the front, a crude circle like the one drawn on the face of someone already condemned. Brielle stood still for a few seconds, her heartbeat slowing in a way that felt wrong, because in a world like this, anything placed too neatly is usually something meant to be opened. She stepped closer. Her fingertips touched the edge of the envelope. The dry stiffness of the paper raised gooseflesh on her skin. She pulled out a stack of photos. The first was her at the intersection. The moment she knelt beside Margot, her face turned partly away, eyes red from smoke, and a red circle drawn directly around her face like a target. The second was Noah stepping out of their boarding house, a streetlight washing over his hair, and another red circle drawn around Noah. Brielle felt her stomach tighten hard. Her hand shook as she turned the third, the fourth, and then the papers slipped from her fingers, as if strength had left them, because what came next wasn't photos anymore. It was a printed schedule, line by line. Noah's movements broken down by the hour, his shift at the store, his class time, the walk home, even a note about one day he stopped at a fast food place because there was a promotion, something Brielle herself couldn't even remember. One line had been underlined thickly in red. Tonight, Noah would leave the grocery store at that time. Brielle couldn't breathe. She looked around the room as if someone were standing behind her, as if the cameras were recording the exact moment she broke. Then she saw the last sheet, only one sentence, handwritten in block capitals, black ink pressed so hard it looked carved into the paper. Choose your brother or choose your life. No signature, no explanation, only the confidence of the words, like a hand closing around her throat. Brielle stumbled back, bumping the edge of the bed, and in her mind she heard the old man's dry laugh through the phone, heard the message "you've seen too much," heard the word burden whispered out in the yard. She bent to gather the photos and the schedule, trying to keep her hands from shaking, but tears pushed out anyway. This was no longer a vague threat. This was a knife laid against Noah's throat, and the person holding it knew her entire life and knew the roads inside this estate. She burst out the door, yanking it open hard enough that the hinges made a small sound, and instantly, 2 guards appeared in the hallway, as if they'd stepped out of the walls. "I need to see Cameron," Brielle said, her voice raw, fighting for calm, but her eyes had already confessed everything. They exchanged a glance, then escorted her down quickly, past the silent steps, past corridors that felt endless, to a wide room with glass walls overlooking an inner courtyard, where Cameron was speaking with Miles. The moment Cameron saw Brielle holding the stack of photos and papers, his face darkened, as if someone had snuffed out a light. Brielle threw them onto the table, no longer able to hold on to manners. "They know Noah," she said, and the words cracked straight out of her chest. Cameron flipped through the photos and the schedule fast, his eyes not blinking, only his jaw tightening so hard a vein stood out. Miles stood beside him, his expression shifting from suspicion to strain, because information like this could not arrive from outside unless someone had opened a door for it. Cameron turned to Miles, his voice dropping into something dangerous. "Lock the entire estate," he said, and within seconds Brielle heard electronic locks engaging throughout the house, a synchronized sound like teeth meshing. Cameron moved to the glass, pressed a button on the control panel, and the lights outside changed color, the distant gate sealing shut. "No one in or out," he added, his gaze still pinned to the pages as if staring at an enemy. Miles nodded, pulled his earpiece out, and began issuing rapid instructions to the security team. But Cameron stopped him with a look. then added one sentence that made Brielle's skin go cold, because she understood he was trying to protect her from the truth itself. Audit every internal route, every camera, every staff member, Cameron said, each word hard as steel. But don't let her know all of it. She'll panic. Brielle stood there, hearing panic like a label stuck to her forehead. And she wanted to push back, wanted to say she wasn't a child, but her throat tightened around something else, something even more terrifying than being seen as weak. Whoever sent that envelope had been inside the estate. Whoever it was knew which room was hers, and whoever it was knew how to place something on her table without being seen. A mole was no longer a suspicion. It was the reality sitting in Brielle's hands, in the form of a red circle drawn around her face and around her brother's. After the order to lock down the estate went out, the air inside the house changed instantly, as if every room had been drained of oxygen and replaced with a silence so thick it had weight. Miles left with his earpiece pressed tight, his voice ricocheting down the corridor like commands fired in rapid succession, while Brielle stood motionless at the table, eyes stuck on the red circles drawn around Noah's face, feeling as if an invisible hand were squeezing her heart in time with each beat. Cameron gathered the stack of papers, squared them the way you square an active case file, then slid them into a stiff folder, not to keep Brielle from looking anymore, but as if he were trying to keep this world from piercing through her one more time. From now on, you don't leave the main house, he said, his tone even, not loud, but leaving no room for argument. You'll have someone with you. Always. Brielle lifted her head and met his eyes. I need to go outside, she snapped back, her voice rough from crying and holding it in. I need to find Noah. I need to do it myself. Cameron cut her off. No, he said, and this time the word didn't sound like an answer. It sounded like a wall. Noah is being watched. You showing up there only gives them one more target to tighten. Brielle felt anger flare, hot and clean, because she was finally exhausted from other people deciding her life. You don't have the right to order me around, she said, stepping forward as if she could reclaim the distance of power that kept pushing her back. I'm not a prisoner. The words came out fast and sharp, and the moment she said them, she felt them vibrate inside her chest, because she had lived like a prisoner of poverty for too long, a prisoner of a foster system that raised you and then dropped you, a prisoner of apologies that always hovered on the tip of her tongue. Cameron looked at her. His expression barely changed, but a shadow passed through his eyes like a cloud crossing the sun. A prisoner is someone locked up to be punished, he said slowly, like he was explaining something obvious to someone who had never seen a war. You're being held here to stay alive. Brielle let out a short, bitter laugh. Alive how? When I can't walk out a door? When I can't have my phone? When I can't decide one step? She said, and this time her voice broke, not because she was weak, but because she was trapped. Cameron moved closer, but stopped at a careful distance, as if he had drawn a line for himself that he would not cross. He didn't touch her. He didn't force her into a chair. He didn't use his larger body to dominate her, even though he could have. I'm not taking things from you to satisfy my power, he said, and for the first time his voice softened by a single degree. Small, but enough for Brielle to hear it wasn't entirely ice anymore. I'm keeping you alive, Brielle. He said her first name, without the last, and the way he said it made Brielle pause as if she'd been caught. She felt the familiar apology rise. Sorry for raising her voice. Sorry for causing trouble. Sorry for existing in a house that wasn't hers. She opened her mouth, the first sound nearly forming. Then she bit down and swallowed it like a bitter pill. She didn't apologize. Not because she was proud, but because she suddenly understood that here, an apology would turn her into someone who owed. I don't need you to keep me, Brielle said, forcing her words to stand upright even as her legs trembled. I need my brother. I need to know he's still breathing like normal. Cameron held her gaze for a moment, then turned toward the glass, as if he didn't want his eyes to reveal too much. We're handling Noah, he said, his voice returning to cold, but no longer cruel. You'll be updated, but you're not going. Brielle took another step, almost ready to slam her hand on the table, then stopped, because she realized she was standing in front of a man who did everything for a reason, even when his reasons made her feel like she couldn't breathe. You keep saying we like I belong, she shot back, and the words carried a thin softness she hated in herself. Cameron turned. His eyes landed on the pendant at her throat, then on the bandage on her arm. You belong to their target list, he said plainly, not dressing it up. That's the only truth I'm sure of. Brielle felt hollow, but inside that hollow there was a small, hard point, like a nail that refused to fall. So I'm supposed to sit still and wait while they kill Noah so I can live? She asked, her voice like a blade turned inward. Cameron's jaw tightened for a brief second. Then he said, his voice dropping lower still, like a vow he didn't want to speak aloud. No one touches Noah while I'm still breathing. The words sent cold down Brielle's spine, because they were both a promise and a reminder that her safety now depended on another person's breath. Cameron stepped back, as if closing the argument before it turned into a crack that couldn't be repaired. Your room, he said, and he didn't move closer, only pointed toward the staircase. There's someone outside your door. If you need anything, call. Brielle looked at him, wanting to say she didn't need anything but freedom, but she held it back. When she turned to go upstairs, she heard his footsteps follow for a few paces, then stop before he came too near her door, as if he respected the last boundary she had left in this fortress. Brielle stepped into her room, shut the door, leaned against it, her heart pounding like a drum, the pendant cold on her chest like a seal. She realized she had lost a battle, but not necessarily the war, because for the first time in her life, she hadn't apologized for protecting someone she loved. And that refusal to apologize, small as it was, felt like her first step out of the invisible prison she had locked herself inside for years. Brielle had barely managed a few breaths in the cold, beautiful room that felt like a showroom when a light knock sounded at the door. Not a polite request, but a procedural knock, and then the door opened just enough for a guard to slide in a phone, the same plain black kind, and say curtly that she had a call. Brielle's heart dropped into her stomach, and then leapt straight up into her throat, because in this world there was only one call she was waiting for. She snatched the phone and answered. Noah filled the screen, but the image was unstable, shaking hard, the light changing in quick pulses as if he were running through patches of street lamps. Bree! Noah panted, his voice shredded by wind and panic. Can you hear me? I'm being followed. Brielle shot to her feet, the pendant knocking against her chest. Where are you? Where are you? She demanded, trying to keep her voice steady, but it cracked anyway. Noah swung the camera behind him for one brief moment, just long enough for Brielle to see sidewalk, moving shadows, a black vehicle rolling slow like a shark, and a man on foot, with his hands in his jacket pockets, his pace too even, too unhurried. I left the cafe like you told me, Noah said, eyes darting as if he were searching for an exit in a familiar maze that had suddenly become foreign. But when I went down the street, I saw someone behind me. I changed direction. I crossed. I went into a store. He stayed on me. Brielle felt the blood in her body turn cold. Go where there are people, she repeated, clinging to the only rope she had. Don't go down empty streets. Every block has cameras. Stand right under a camera. I'm running into a convenience store, Noah said, and the screen shook even harder, his breathing tearing at the microphone. Bree, I see two of them. Through the camera, Brielle caught the neon sign ahead, saw Noah's hand tremble as he shoved at the door, and at that exact moment another hand reached from behind, close to Noah's shoulder, like it was about to seize him and yank him back. Brielle screamed, a sound that didn't even form into words, and Noah lunged forward into the store, the glass door bursting open, the bell above it ringing bright and sharp like salvation. Noah didn't stop. He ran straight between the aisles and pressed himself near the register where the clerk stood with his mouth hanging open. Call 911, Noah blurted to him, his voice breaking, and then he lifted the phone close to his face, eyes wet and red. Bree, I got inside. The door auto-locks. He's outside. Brielle pressed the phone to her ear as if she could pull Noah through the screen. Don't go out, she said. Don't go outside. Hear me. Noah nodded hard, and through the glass behind him, Brielle saw the silhouette of a man standing right at the door, not charging in, only looking through the window the way someone looks at fish in a tank, calm in a way that was terrifying. The man lifted one finger, slowly, then pointed straight at Noah, as if to say, I see you. Noah folded in on himself, his back pinned to the counter. Brielle wanted to run, to fly down the stairs, to tear open the iron gate, to throw herself out of this estate and get to her brother, and the urge rose so violently she felt her vision dim at the edges. She burst out of her room, nearly slamming into the hallway, and a guard stepped in front of her at once. Move, Brielle said, her voice sharp. I have to go. No, the guard replied, expression unchanged. Brielle ran down the stairs and along the corridors, searching for Cameron like someone who was drowning searches for air. She found him near a control area, speaking with Miles and several others, his eyes cold. But the moment Brielle rushed in, he recognized the disaster written all over her face. Noah, Brielle choked out, thrusting the phone toward him. They're closing in on him right now. Cameron looked at the screen for a second, long enough to see Noah trembling in the store, long enough to see the shadow outside the glass. Then he turned to Miles and issued orders fast, his voice like steel striking stone. Team 1, go to that address. Team 2, seal every exit around the area. Don't let him reach the car. Miles had already pulled his earpiece out and started relaying commands, but Brielle didn't care who was moving. She only looked at Cameron. I'm going with you, she said immediately, like it was the only possible thing. Cameron didn't hesitate. No, he said, and that no made something inside Brielle explode. You don't understand, Brielle shouted, her voice shaking from everything crashing together at once. That's my brother. If they drag him into a car, whatever you call handling, it won't bring him back. Cameron stepped closer, but still kept that distance he always kept, his eyes not soft, his voice dropping low and hard, so Brielle would hear every word. If you show up there, he'll have 2 hostages instead of 1, he said, and he'll win instantly. Brielle went still for a beat, because she knew he was right, and the rightness of it was more brutal than being wrong. On the screen, Noah crouched behind the counter while the clerk spoke into a phone, and the man outside still stood there, as if waiting for the exact moment he needed. Brielle bit her lip until she tasted blood, forcing herself not to cry, because crying wasted time, and she didn't have time. She looked at Cameron, and for the first time her eyes didn't beg. They swore. If anything happens to Noah, she said, her voice quiet but sharp as glass, I will never forgive anyone. Cameron didn't answer with words. He only looked back at her, his gaze stamping something into place, then turned away to keep issuing orders, as if Brielle's forgiveness was a luxury he wasn't allowed to hope for. Brielle returned to her room not because she was calm, but because she had nowhere else to stand, and every step on the dark carpet felt like stepping on her own heartbeat. Inside, she began packing with feverish speed, grabbing the simple clothes, stuffing them into a bag, pulling the pendant off, and then fastening it back on, because her hands shook too hard, searching for anything she could carry, like someone preparing to flee a burning house. She didn't know where she would run. She only knew that sitting still meant dying slowly. As she yanked the zipper closed, the black phone buzzed on the bed. A new message. Unknown number. No name. Brielle opened it, and everything inside her froze. On the screen was a photo of Noah from behind, taken close, too close, sharp enough to show the fine hairs at the back of his neck. And in front of Noah was that convenience store, the neon sign still glowing, meaning whoever took it had been standing directly behind Noah before Noah managed to run inside. Beneath the photo was a single short line, like a whisper into her ear. Your brother runs fast. Brielle stared at the photo of Noah from behind until her eyes burned, but that burn was nothing compared to the cold spreading along her spine, cold from understanding that whoever sent it had been close enough to breathe against the back of her brother's neck, and close enough to walk into this estate and lay an envelope on her table. She didn't believe in locks or cameras anymore, because if one person could do all of that, then every layer of protection here was only glossy paint over a crack. Brielle zipped the bag shut, shoved the black phone into her jacket, and walked straight to the door like a decision that had been forming since Cameron said no, and the world answered with a photograph. The guard outside stood upright like a statue, but Brielle had been watching. She had seen them rotate shifts by rhythm. She had noticed the thin, fragile gap between 2 hallway checks, and that gap was all she needed. She opened the door so softly it barely moved the air, slipped out, stayed close to the wall, and set her feet on the carpet without a sound, her heart pounding so hard she was afraid the beat itself would trigger an alarm. She took the service staircase down, moved through a staff corridor where a faint kitchen smell drifted, and for a brief second, she saw herself sliding back into her old role, sneaking, enduring, slipping away from other people's power, only this time she wasn't running to protect herself. She was running to save someone she loved. The back door opened onto the rear grounds, and night wind slapped her face awake. Brielle pulled up her hood, kept her head down, and ran through the dark line of trees toward the drive out. where the iron gate in the distance looked like a black thread cutting across the sky. She didn't know what was happening to Noah right now. She only knew she couldn't sit still and wait for a message telling her brother had disappeared. She ran, and in her mind every warning Cameron had given her turned into noise, unable to drown out the one sentence that mattered. I have to get to him. When Brielle got closer to the gate, she heard an engine and thought it was a guard vehicle. But then something else appeared under the sensor lights. A small car angled across the drive as if it had slid, hazard lights blinking, thin smoke lifting from the hood, an accident that was too neat, too perfectly placed, too perfectly sized to block the road like a cork. A man stood beside the car with his hands on his hips, wearing irritation like it was real. But when Brielle slowed, his eyes flicked to her, and that flick didn't belong to someone who needed help. It belonged to someone who had just spotted the right prey. Brielle stepped back on instinct, but it was too late. From behind, another vehicle surged forward, fast and tight, headlights sweeping across her like a pair of eyes. Tires hissed. Brielle spun to run into the trees, but the vehicle cut hard toward the curb, trapping her path, and the passenger door jerked open halfway as if ready to swallow her whole. She heard her blood in her ears. Everything slowed into sick fragments. Light, engine noise, the sound of her own breath. Brielle lifted her hands like a shield and backed away, her foot catching the edge of the drive, and in the instant she thought she would fall, another dark shape slammed into motion faster than fear. An SUV shot out from inside the estate and cut across between her and the unfamiliar vehicle. With a turn so precise, Brielle heard metal touch metal, light as a warning. The SUV door opened, and Cameron stepped out, not running, but each step he took felt like it pushed the air backward. He didn't look at Brielle at first. His eyes locked on the car that had pinned her, then locked on the man beside the accident car, and in that look was something terrifyingly cold. The cold of someone watching a murder script being performed on his own property. Cameron walked forward without drawing a gun for show, without shouting, simply stepping into the exact point between the other car's front end and the half-open door, then placing one hand on the door's edge and pushing, gentle but final, until it shut as if an invisible force had pressed it closed. He bent down to the window level and said something short. Brielle couldn't make out the words, only saw the person inside go rigid. Then Cameron raised his hand, 2 fingers pinching the side mirror, twisting it by the smallest angle, so small most people wouldn't notice, but the other car reacted instantly, flinching like a nerve had been touched. Cameron straightened. His eyes never left them. And then he made one of those surgical movements that seemed to be his signature. No blood, no spectacle, only the clear message that if the other side moved 1 inch more, the outcome would no longer be an accident. The car that had trapped Brielle eased backward, slow, careful, retreating like an animal that had just felt a larger animal's teeth at the back of its neck. The man beside the accident car stepped back too, eyes darting. Then he jumped into his own vehicle. Within seconds, both cars vanished from the gate area as if they'd never existed, leaving only the trap car's hazard lights blinking. And then those went dark as well. A prop finished with its role. Cameron snapped around to Brielle, and for the first time she saw real anger on his face. Not anger at being challenged, but anger sharpened by fear. "What the hell were you doing?" he said, his voice rough, each word grinding through his teeth. Brielle opened her mouth to argue, to say she had no choice, to say Noah was being hunted, but her throat locked on the image of that car door opening, waiting to pull her inside. She looked at Cameron, and suddenly all the fight in her dropped away like a snapped wire. I couldn't sit still," she managed, and the words weren't sharp anymore. They were only desperation. Cameron took 1 step closer, then stopped before he touched her, as if he were wrestling with instinct on one side and principle on the other. "Sitting still is living," he said, still hard, but lower now. Brielle shook her head. Tears came anyway, not because she was weak, but because her body finally let go of the strain she'd been holding from the intersection until now. "I've lived my whole life by sitting still," she sobbed, "and people still took everything from me. I only have Noah." Cameron looked at her for a long time, his eyes darkening, and in that darkness Brielle saw something she hadn't expected. Not pity, but recognition, as if he'd just seen a wound in her that matched a wound in himself. "You won't go alone again," Cameron said, and this time it wasn't an empty order. It was a vow pushed out by fear that had almost become real. He turned and signaled the guards. The SUV door opened, and Brielle was guided back inside the gate. back down the long driveway that led into the house like a base. As the vehicle moved, Brielle turned her head and looked through the tinted glass toward the gate where the trap had just been, and she began to truly cry, because for the first time in her life, when she tried to run into danger, someone had chased after her, not to drag her back, but to put himself between her and a car coming straight at her, to keep her alive the way he'd promised. And that truth, painful and warm at the same time, left her not knowing how to breathe correctly anymore. Brielle had barely managed to wash her face, barely managed to force herself to sit on the edge of the bed and breathe evenly, when the whole house seemed to jolt by a single beat, not with an explosion or a scream, but with the thunder of hurried footsteps racing down the hall and the sharp crackle of earpieces, like fine rain. A guard appeared at her door, knocked once, short, then said, "Mrs. Vale had a problem and all key personnel were being called in." Brielle shot to her feet, her face still wet, her hands still trembling from the panic at the gate that hadn't fully faded. And now a different fear rose up, deeper and heavier, because Margot was the only reason Brielle was